Albert Fitch's post-bag was on the wrong bench. That was the first thing Miss Marple noticed. Not the roses along Mrs. Peel's front path, though they were very fine for October, and not the crack in the church bell tower, which Mrs. Peel had been writing letters about to the diocese for 3 years without reply. The post-bag. Brown canvas, slightly worn at the left strap where Albert had carried it on the same shoulder for 22 years. Sitting on the bench outside the Red Lion public house at 9:15 in the morning. Albert Fitch did not drink. Everyone in Chippingcroft knew this. He was a Methodist, a thin, careful man who wore the same grey coat from September through April and kept his bicycle tyres aired to an almost fussy precision. He did not sit outside public houses at 9:15. He was, at 9:15, always somewhere between Larkspur Lane and the far end of Church Road. That was his route, had been his route since before some of the villagers were born. Miss Marple noted it and said nothing. She was visiting Mrs. Peel for a fortnight. Dorothy Peel, née Hartley, whom she had known since they were girls, at the same dreary dancing class in Bath, both equally hopeless at the waltz. Dorothy had married sensibly and moved to the Cotswolds, and grown into the kind of woman who knew everything about everyone. In a 3-mile radius, and considered this a perfectly respectable hobby. Miss Marple found it restful to visit. There was always something to think about in a village where people knew each other too well. "You'll want tea before anything," Dorothy said, taking her coat. The train was late, wasn't it? It's always late on Tuesdays. It's something to do with the Cirencester Junction, apparently, though they've been saying that for 5 years. It was 11 minutes, Miss Marple agreed. The young man across from me was very put out. He had a meeting, I think. They always have meetings. Dorothy steered her firmly toward the sitting room. "Sit down. Don't look at the garden. I haven't done the beds yet, and I don't want to hear about it." Miss Marple sat. She did glance at the garden. She couldn't help it. But she said nothing about the beds. The roses were quite good. The lawn wanted doing. The tea came, and with it Dorothy's full attention, which meant the village came too. Mrs. Price Ridley had finally sold the house on Vicarage Road to a couple from Bristol, young, no children yet, but Dorothy suspected it wouldn't be long, or the Hendersons' eldest boy had come back from London rather suddenly, and nobody quite knew why, though there were several theories. The post office had a new girl behind the counter, Janet Foley's niece, very efficient but slightly cold, not like Janet at all. And Gerald Holt, Dorothy said, pouring a second cup with the particular emphasis of someone saving the best piece of news. "You won't have heard. It happened Wednesday. Heart, Dr. Somerton said. Found him in his study. His wife was out." Miss Marple looked up. "Gerald Holt, that's Larkspur Lane." "Number 14, yes. Retired solicitor. Been here, 12 years, 13. You've never met him, I don't think. Quiet sort of man. Older. His wife is considerably younger, which everyone noticed and some people mentioned rather too often." Dorothy set the teapot down. "Diana, as she's called, Diana Holt. She's been very composed about the whole thing, which some people find appropriate and others find suspicious, which I think says more about the people than about Diana. How old was he? 71. Heart trouble for years, apparently." Dr. Somerton wasn't at all surprised. "No," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "I imagine he wasn't." She said it to herself, really. Dorothy didn't notice. The next morning Miss Marple walked to the post office because she needed stamps. and because the post office in any village is the closest thing to a complete record of human behaviour that exists. The new girl, Janet Foley's niece, whose name turned out to be Carol, was efficient and slightly cold, as advertised. Yet she sold Miss Marple a book of stamps with the speed of someone who considered stamps a transaction rather than an opportunity, which was a waste of a good post office, Miss Marple felt. But there were 2 other women at the counter ahead of her, and they were talking about Gerald Holt. Philip Rowe was there Friday, one of them said, stout, in a green coat, Mrs. Something, Miss Marple didn't know her. At the house. Saw him myself going in. After the solicitor, I'd think, said the other, younger, sharply interested. The will. Well, he'd want to know, wouldn't he? Gerald's nephew. There's money there. Is there? There was. Gerald was careful with money. The old-fashioned sort of careful, you know. But Philip's another matter entirely. Philip spends. They moved away with their parcels. Miss Marple bought her stamps. She was walking back along Church Street when she saw Albert Fitch coming the other way, pushing his bicycle. He was later than he should have been. She had a reasonable sense of village rhythms by now, and he was looking at the pavement with the concentrated attention of a man who does not want to look up and meet anyone's eyes. Miss Marple stepped slightly to the side. Albert looked up, saw her, and the expression on his face was brief but legible. Not guilt exactly, not fear. Something that sat between the two. The look of a man who has been carrying something heavier than his post-bag, and is not at all sure how to put it down. "Good morning," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "You must be Mr. Fitch. I'm staying with Mrs. Peel. She's mentioned you. Says the post is always exactly on time, which she considers a civic virtue." Albert blinked. "Mrs. Peel's very kind. She is. Though she did mention it was slightly off this week. Tuesday, she thought." A pause, a small telling pause, the kind that lasts just a half-second too long. "Knee's been giving me trouble," Albert said. "Had to go slower." "Oh, I'm sorry to hear it," Miss Marple said warmly. "My nephew always says one shouldn't ignore knees. They store up grievances." Albert almost smiled. "They do that." He wheeled his bicycle past her with a nod and continued down Church Street, not looking back. Miss Marple watched him go. She thought about Mr. Havering in St. Mary Mead, years ago now, who had changed the time he walked his dog by exactly 40 minutes, the morning after Mrs. Havering had her fall. Not because he had done anything wrong, and because he had seen something he wasn't supposed to see. And the simplest way not to be asked about it was to make sure he hadn't been there at the right time to see it. Some people run when they know something. Albert Fitch had simply changed his route. Dorothy had a full account of the Holt household ready at lunch, presented between the soup and the cold chicken, with the efficiency of someone who has been marshalling village intelligence for 30 years. Gerald Holt had come to Chippingcroft from London, where he had been a solicitor with a quiet and reasonably successful practice. He had no children. He had been married before. A first wife, Margaret, who had died in 1941 during the war. Some said of illness, and some said of a broken heart. And Dorothy considered both these things might be true simultaneously. He had met Diana Carver at some function in Cheltenham. She was 34 years younger, which Dorothy stated as a fact and not a judgment, though the slight set of her mouth suggested she had feelings about it. And they had married in 1952, quietly, and moved into the Larkspur Lane house. "He wasn't unhappy," Dorothy said, as though this were surprising. "I think he was actually rather content." She's not an unkind woman, Diana. Distant, maybe, self-contained. But she looked after him properly, made sure he took his pills, kept the house, didn't spend his money. His pills, Miss Marple said. Heart medication. Dr. Somerton's been prescribing them for years. Digitalis, I think, or something of that sort. I don't know the specifics. No, of course not. Miss Marple ate a small piece of chicken. And Philip Rowe? Is he local? Comes from Stroud, I think. He visited Gerald 2 or 3 times a year. They weren't close exactly. Gerald was his mother's brother, something like that. Philip is— Dorothy paused, choosing words with mild care. Philip is charming, very charming. The sort of charming that makes you check your handbag afterwards, which is unkind of me, but there it is. He borrowed money from Gerald twice that I know of, possibly more that I don't. And the will. Nobody knows for certain. Gerald was private about money, the way solicitors often are, but Philip always seemed to assume, the way some people do, that comfortable assumption. Gerald's oldest relative, no children. A Diana much younger. Philip seemed to feel the logic was obvious. Dorothy's expression indicated she found Philip's logic not entirely wrong, which was a kind of social accounting Miss Marple recognized from every village she had ever visited. Inheritance had its own gravitational pull. People organized themselves around it without quite meaning to. "When did Philip last visit?" Miss Marple asked, picking up her tea. Dorothy thought. "He was here in September. I saw him in the village. He was at the Red Lion for lunch. And then," she frowned, "Mrs. Bancroft's cook mentioned seeing someone at Gerald's gate last week. Tuesday, I think she said, early." Miss Marple set her cup down. "Early," she repeated. "How early?" "Oh, I don't know the specifics. Mrs. Bancroft's cook is not always precise. She said the post hadn't come yet. She noticed because she was waiting for a letter from her sister in Dorset. The post hadn't come yet, which meant before 8:30 at the earliest. Before Albert Fitch had reached Larkspur Lane on his route. Or, and this was the thing that made Miss Marple sit very still for just a moment, at the exact time Albert Fitch was on Larkspur Lane, if he had been running early. Gerald Holt died on Wednesday. Albert Fitch changed his route on Tuesday, not after the death, before it. She looked out at Dorothy's garden, where the roses were quite good and the lawn wanted doing, and she thought that sometimes the most frightening thing about a murder is not the act itself. It is the hours before it, when someone is deciding. "More tea?" Dorothy said. "Please," said Miss Marple. "Yes, I think so." She walked past number 14 on her way back from the village that afternoon. She didn't stop. There was nothing to stop for, but she looked. Stone cottage well kept, dark curtains drawn in the front room, a wreath on the door, black ribbon proper. Diana Holt had done everything correctly. A woman was clipping the hedge next door. She stopped when she saw Miss Marple slow. "Terrible thing," the woman said, gesturing vaguely at number 14. "Gerald Holt, though he wasn't well, of course. We all knew he wasn't well." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, coming to the gate. "Did you know him well?" "Well enough. Good morning, kept to himself. His wife was pleasant when you saw her, which wasn't often. She didn't really participate, if you know what I mean. In the village, not unfriendly, just not here, if that makes sense." "It does." Miss Marple looked at the drawn curtains. "I understand his nephew has been here." "Philip? Yes, I've seen his car twice this week. Once on Sunday, which was before Gerald died, and once on Thursday, after." The woman's voice held something speculative, professionally neutral, He seems very concerned about the arrangements." "The arrangements," Miss Marple said. "That's what he says." Miss Marple thanked her, said something pleasant about the hedge, and walked on. Philip Row on Sunday. On Tuesday morning, maybe, if Mrs. Bancroft's cook was right. And on Thursday, after. 3 visits. The last one Gerald Holt did not know about, could not have known about. Miss Marple walked back to Dorothy's house slowly, her hands folded, her eyes on the road ahead, thinking about digitalis and teacups, and the particular mercy of an overworked village doctor who had expected a heart to fail, and was, therefore, not surprised when it did. The funeral was on Friday. Miss Marple hadn't planned to go. She hadn't known Gerald Holt, not really, and there is a certain kind of attendance at funerals that feels like trespassing. But Dorothy wanted company, and Dorothy was the sort of woman who considered funerals a social obligation in the same category as weddings and harvest festivals, something the village did together, whether it wanted to or not. St. Bartholomew's was cold. It was always cold, Dorothy whispered, even in August, something to do with the stone and the way the north wall faced the hill. The pews filled steadily, more people than Miss Marple expected for a man who had kept to himself. Of villagers turn out for death. It is one of the things they are still good at. Diana Holt sat in the front pew. She was wearing black, which was correct, and her back was straight, which was either composure or effort. And Miss Marple, who had seen a great many people at a great many funerals, could not immediately tell which. Diana was not pretty exactly. Handsome, maybe. Strong-boned face, dark hair going grey at the temples, the kind of woman who would have been striking at 25, and was still, at 40 or so, someone you noticed when she entered a room. She did not cry during the service. She looked at the coffin steadily, with an expression that Miss Marple found she couldn't quite read from 3 pews back. Philip Row was there too. Of course he was. He was younger than Miss Marple had imagined. 35, perhaps, or a well-preserved 40. Dark suit, good shoes, the kind of face that knew it was appealing and had long since stopped being surprised by this. He sat 2 pews behind Diana, not beside her, behind her, slightly to the left, where he could watch her without it being obvious. Miss Marple noticed him noticing Diana. She also noticed, quite separately, that Albert Fitch was in the back pew near the door, which was where working men sat at Chippingcroft funerals. She'd gathered that much from Dorothy, and that Albert was very still throughout the entire service, in the way that people are still when they are controlling something. Dr. Somerton read a passage. He was a broad, tired-looking man in his late 50s, the kind of country doctor who has seen too much and slept too little, and still turns up when you ring him. He read the passage without particular feeling, which wasn't unkindness, it was exhaustion. He had been Gerald's doctor for 9 years. He had expected this, had perhaps been half expecting it for 2 of those 9 years, and the expectation had done its work and left a small blunted place where the grief might otherwise have been. After the service in the churchyard, Dorothy moved through people with the ease of long practice, gathering and distributing information like a very efficient postal service. Miss Marple stayed near the path and watched. Diana received condolences. She was gracious. She thanked people with a word or two, a brief touch of the hand, the correct amount of eye contact. She did not linger. She did not, and this is what Miss Marple noticed, she did not look at the grave after the coffin was lowered, as she looked at the vicar. She looked at her hands. She looked once across the churchyard in a direction that wasn't anything in particular. She was somewhere else, entirely. Her body was at Gerald Holt's funeral, and the rest of her was somewhere Miss Marple couldn't see. That could mean grief. Real grief does that. Takes you somewhere private and unreachable. Or it could mean something else. The trouble was, it looked the same from the outside. Philip Rowe approached Diana after most people had drifted away. They spoke for perhaps 2 minutes. Miss Marple was not close enough to hear, but she could see the shape of the conversation. Philip leaning in slightly. Diana not leaning back, but not leaning toward him either. At one point, Diana shook her head. Once, quickly. Philip said something else. Diana said something short and turned away. Philip watched her walk to the waiting car. His expression, just briefly, was not grief. It was not even regret. It was the face of a man doing a calculation. "She's holding up remarkably," Dorothy said at tea, which meant Dorothy found Diana's composure faintly suspicious and was being charitable about it. "Grief is different in different people," Miss Marple said. "Oh, of course. Yes, absolutely." Dorothy poured. "It's just, well, she hardly knew anyone here. Gerald was the one with roots, so to speak. She came with him. And now what does she do? Does she stay in the village? Does she go back to wherever she came from? She's not old, Jane. She has a whole—" Dorothy waved her hand. "A whole life still. And Gerald he was kind to her, I think, but he was old and not well." Miss Marple said nothing. I'm not saying anything," Dorothy said firmly, which meant she was saying something. "No," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "What did you think of Philip Rowe at the service?" Dorothy's expression shifted. Less comfortable now. He looked well, considering. He did. A bit too well, perhaps. His suit was very good. She paused. "John Eddington, you haven't met him. He's on the parish council. John told me last month that Philip owed money to someone in Cheltenham. Not a small amount. He didn't know the details." "No?" "Gerald had given him money before. Twice that I know of." Dorothy said it again, like she was reminding herself. Twice. There it was. Twice. And Gerald had changed his will. Miss Marple didn't know this for certain yet. It was still just a shape in the fog, but she thought he had. Thought it very likely, because why else would Philip have come on Sunday? Not to visit, not for the pleasure of his elderly uncle's company, to discuss, to perhaps argue, to try one more time to arrange the future to his satisfaction. And then on Tuesday, maybe, to settle the matter differently. She thought about this while Dorothy talked about the parish council and the hedge dispute on Vicarage Road. She thought about it carefully, like turning a stone over to look at what was underneath. And what was underneath was not pleasant, but it was clear. She found Dr. Somerton the following morning quite by chance, or not entirely by chance. She had walked past the surgery twice already, which she considered reconnaissance rather than loitering, and introduced herself as Dorothy Peel's houseguest. He was polite, distracted, clearly about to do 6 things at once. "Gerald Holt," she said pleasantly, as though it were an afterthought. Such a sad business. Dorothy knew him slightly. Yes, it was. Dr. Somerton had his coat half on. Not unexpected, I'm afraid. Hart had been under pressure for years. I'd been quite clear with him about that. He took his medication regularly. The doctor paused, looked at her with the mild alertness of a man who suddenly remembers he is not speaking to Dorothy Peel, but to a stranger. As far as I knew, yes. His wife made sure of it. She was very diligent. He finished putting his coat on. "Is there something specific, miss? I'm sorry, I've forgotten." "Marple! No, nothing specific at all. Just an old woman's curiosity." She smiled. "The sort one accumulates with age." He smiled back, a professional smile, tired around the edges. "Well, it was heart failure. He was 71 with a compromised cardiac history. These things happen." "They do," Miss Marple said, "more often than one would like." He left. She stood outside the surgery for a moment in the thin October sun. He believed it. He genuinely believed it. And why wouldn't he? He had been watching Gerald Holt's heart for 9 years. He had the notes, the history, the context. A doctor who expects a thing to happen, and then the thing happens, does not look for another explanation. That is not negligence. That is human. That is, Miss Marple thought, exactly what someone had counted on. Albert Fitch came to Mrs. Peel's gate at 4:30. Miss Marple was in the front garden, supposedly tidying the rose beds that Dorothy had neglected, actually waiting, as she had sent word through the butcher's delivery boy. A very good messenger, alert, not particularly curious, that Mrs. Peel was wondering if Mr. Fitch would mind calling round about a parcel she'd been expecting. There was no parcel. Dorothy didn't know about this arrangement and was inside listening to the wireless. Albert came through the gate with the careful expression of a man who suspects a thing, but can't quite prove it yet. He looked at Miss Marple, looked at the empty porch. "Mrs. Peel's parcel," he said. "I'm afraid I invented that," Miss Marple said calmly, setting down her trowel. "Do forgive me. I wanted to speak to you without making a fuss of it. Would you sit for a moment? There's a bench round the side. Dorothy won't hear us from there." He didn't move for a second or two. A muscle in his jaw worked. He was frightened. She could see that plainly now. Not acute fear, not panic, but the long grinding kind that settles into a person like damp, makes everything heavier. "I'm not police," she added. "I'm an old woman from St. Mary Mead visiting her friend. I have no authority and no official capacity whatsoever." Albert looked at her. And then, because he had been carrying it since Tuesday, and probably hadn't slept properly in 4 nights, he went round to the bench and sat down. Miss Marple sat beside him. She did not rush. She had learned over many years that silence is more useful than questions if you give it long enough. "I saw him," Albert said finally. "Tuesday morning." Miss Marple waited. I was early. My knee was better that morning, not worse. That's what I told you before, but it wasn't. I was early. I got to Larkspur Lane just before 7:30. He was looking at his hands. Big, careful hands, the knuckles reddened from weather. "I had a registered letter for number 12. Stopped there. And when I came back to my bicycle, number 14 is right there, just across. I saw him coming out the garden gate." "Philip Rowe," Miss Marple said quietly. Albert looked up sharply. "I don't know him by name," he said, "but I've seen him before. He'd been to visit Gerald, Mr. Holt, in the summer. I remembered the face, the good suit." He paused. He had his back to me mostly, but I saw enough. "What time? 7:20, maybe. 7:30 at the latest." "Was he hurrying?" A pause. Not hurrying, but not strolling either, something in between. Like someone who wants to move quickly, but doesn't want to look like they're moving quickly, if that makes sense. It made perfect sense. "He didn't see you?" "I don't think so. I'd stepped back for the bicycle. He turned toward the road, toward the village, and walked off. He didn't look round." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "And then you changed your route." Albert's throat moved. "I came back down Larkspur the next day, and the news was everywhere by then. Gerald Holt found dead, and I thought—" He stopped, started again. "I thought if I said I'd seen someone at the house before 7:30 the morning before, I'd have to explain what I was doing there that early, and I'd have to— And what if I was wrong? What if it was nothing? He was allowed to visit his uncle." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Oh, he was. But the way he walked away—" Albert shook his head. "The way he walked away, Miss Marple. I've been delivering post for 22 years. I know what people look like in the morning, how they move. When they've had a nice cup of tea and a chat, they move different when they've done something and they just want to be gone." He said it boldly, without drama. And it was more convincing, she thought, than any amount of careful testimony could have been. She didn't say anything for a moment. A robin landed on the garden wall, looked at them both with bright professional interest, and flew away. "Mr. Fitch," Miss Marple said at last, "you didn't cause this. I want to be clear about that. Nothing you did or didn't do on Tuesday morning changed what happened in that house." She looked at him, not unkindly. "Yeah, but you can help now. What you saw, all of it, exactly as you've just told me, will matter. Not to me, to someone who can do something with it." Albert was quiet. His hands were still in his lap, but they weren't clenched any more. "You'll be involved," he said, "once I say it." "Yes. People will talk." "In a village," Miss Marple said, "people talk about everything. They'll talk about this. And then something else will happen, and they'll talk about that. That is the nature of villages, Mr. Fitch. They have very long memories and very short attention spans." Albert almost laughed. It came out as a short breath, not quite a laugh, not quite not. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Mr. Holt was decent," he said quietly. "He always had a word. Asked about my knee last year. Is without me mentioning it, just noticed I was limping." He paused. That's the kind of man he was. Miss Marple said nothing. There are things that don't need a response. She let him have the silence. "All right," Albert said finally. He stood up, straightening his coat with the automatic care of a man who has always been tidy. "All right, what do I do?" "Nothing yet," Miss Marple said. "Wait for me, a day or two." She picked up her trowel. "And Mr. Fitch, thank you for the post. It really is very consistently on time. Dorothy was right about that." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has been handled very skillfully and is just beginning to realize it. Then he nodded, went through the gate, and Miss Marple listened to his footsteps on the path until they were gone, as she sat for a moment in the thinning afternoon light, alone with the roses and the robin and the particular weight of what came next. Gerald Holt had been decent. He had noticed Albert's knee, and someone had put too much digitalis in his morning tea. She stood up, brushed the dirt from her gloves, went inside to think. The night was cold, and Miss Marple didn't sleep well. This wasn't unusual. She hadn't slept properly since about 1947, she sometimes thought, though that wasn't entirely true. There were good nights still. But this was not one of them. She lay in Dorothy's spare room, listening to the house settle around her. The old beams contracting in the cold the way old things do. And she thought about digitalis. It is a common enough medication, derived from foxglove, and there was something almost too neat about that, as something a novelist might invent, but real life produces without irony. It regulates the heart, slows it, steadies it, keeps it doing what hearts are supposed to do without drama. The right dose is therapeutic. The wrong dose is something else entirely. And the particular cruelty of it, if cruelty was the word and she thought it was, is that an overdose in a man already compromised does not look like murder. It looks like exactly what everyone expected. That was the design of it. She was sure of that now. Not a crime of passion, not something done in anger with a blunt object or a gun. This was arranged, thought about. Someone had sat quietly with the knowledge that Gerald Holt took digitalis every morning with his tea, and worked out that 2 tablets instead of 1, or 3 instead of 2, it dissolved in the cup before he came down to breakfast. It wouldn't even taste different or not enough to notice, would do a thing that looked like nature. She thought about Philip Rowe's face at the funeral, the calculation behind the eyes. She thought about Gerald Holt asking about Albert Fitch's knee. She stared at the ceiling for a while. Then she got up, put on her dressing gown, went downstairs, and made herself a cup of cocoa that she didn't particularly want, and sat at Dorothy's kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil, and thought the whole thing through from the beginning. The problem was evidence, or rather, the absence of it. Albert had seen Philip leaving the house at 7:30 on Tuesday morning. That was something. It placed him there, when he had told everyone, apparently, and that he hadn't visited in 2 weeks. That was a lie, and lies matter, but a lie alone is not enough. Philip could explain it a dozen ways. Surprise visit. Wanted to talk to his uncle privately. Didn't mention it because the timing was awkward, because he felt guilty about asking for money again, because any number of things that a clever solicitor's nephew would think of between now and a courtroom. The teacup had been washed. She was nearly certain of it. The housekeeper, Mrs. Crawford, arrived at 9, which Albert had confirmed without knowing he was confirming it. And between 7:30 and 9, there was time enough for Philip to have his conversation with Gerald. Time enough for a cup of tea to be made and drunk and washed and dried and put away. Diana had been out. The house had been empty except for Gerald, Gerald Holt, who noticed Postman's knees and kept to himself and changed his will. She still didn't know this for certain. It was still inference, but she was beginning to trust her inferences. Gerald Holt had drunk his tea and gone to his study and died in his chair, and the world had found it entirely unremarkable. She wrote 3 things on her piece of paper. What Philip knows, what Philip fears, what Philip will do if he thinks there's more to fear. She looked at what she'd written for a long time. Then she drew a small circle round the second one. Fear was the lever. Fear was always the lever, in the end. In the morning she rang Gerald Holt's solicitor's office from the post office telephone. Dorothy's cottage didn't have one, which Miss Marple considered an advantage for this particular purpose, and spoke to a junior clerk named Davies. Young voice, slightly nervous. She had done some asking the previous evening, and learned that Davies had, some months ago, borrowed a not insignificant sum from Philip Rowe to cover a gambling debt. This was the kind of information that moved through villages in strange sideways currents. Dorothy hadn't known it directly, but Mrs. Bancroft's cook knew Davies's landlady, and the landlady had opinions. The chain of knowing was typically baroque, but the information at the end of it was solid. Davies had borrowed from Philip. Philip, presumably, had used this to ensure Davies told him about the will. She didn't tell Davies any of this on the phone. She simply introduced herself as a friend of Gerald Holt's late wife, the first wife, Margaret. and mentioned gently that she had heard there had been some changes to Mr. Holt's testamentary arrangements in recent months. A long pause. "I'm not really at liberty," Davies began. "No, of course not," Miss Marple said warmly. "I wouldn't dream of asking for details. I only wondered, for personal reasons, you understand, whether the charitable arrangements Gerald had discussed with Margaret before her death had finally been included. She cared about them very much." Another pause. Longer. "There was, yes," Davies said carefully, in the voice of someone picking their way across ice. "There were some amendments made in August, to include certain charitable bequests." "August," Miss Marple said. "How good of him! Margaret would have been so pleased." She thanked him and rang off. August. Philip had visited in September, so he had come in September knowing, or suspecting, that the will had been changed, had probably come to argue, or to beg, or both. And then on Tuesday morning, before 7:30, he had come back. The letter took her the better part of an hour to compose properly. Not the writing of it. The writing was quick. She had a clear head for that kind of thing. The difficulty was the tone. It had to be official without being stiff, urgent without being alarming. The sort of letter that would make a guilty man's stomach drop without giving him enough information to prepare a defense. She used Dorothy's best writing paper, which she felt slightly guilty about, and her own fountain pen, which she didn't, and the letter was from, supposedly, a senior partner at Gerald Holt's firm, a Mr. R.V. Caldwell, a name she had taken from the firm's letterhead, which was printed in small type on the correspondence she'd found in Gerald's probate notice in the village post office. She did not know if R.V. Caldwell existed. She rather hoped he did, and that he was the sort of man who would have written this letter if he'd known what she knew. The letter stated, in measured legal language, that a codicil had come to light, attached to an earlier version of the will, overlooked in the initial review, that materially affected Mr. Philip Rowe's position under the estate. It requested his attendance at a meeting at his earliest convenience to discuss certain irregularities in the estate documentation that required clarification before probate could proceed. It did not say what the codicil contained. It did not need to. She read it over twice. Added one small deliberate error, a comma in the wrong place, the kind of thing a tired clerk might let through, and folded it into an envelope addressed in a hand that was not quite her own natural writing, not forged exactly, just adjusted. Then she sat with it for a moment. This was the part she never entirely liked. Not the thinking, not the gathering. That was almost pleasurable, the cold, clean work of assembly. But this, using fear as a tool, pushing on a frightened man and watching what fell out. It was necessary. She knew it was necessary. But it was not pleasant, and she didn't pretend it was. Gerald Holt had asked about Albert Fitch's knee. She sealed the envelope. The letter reached Philip Rowe on Saturday morning, and she knew this because she'd arranged for it to be hand-delivered by the same alert butcher's boy. She was beginning to feel she owed that child a significant tip to Philip's lodgings at the Red Lion, where he had been staying since Thursday. Not a man in a hurry to leave Chippingcroft. That told its own small story. She did not have to wait long. By Saturday afternoon, Philip Rowe had gone to number 14 Larkspur Lane and knocked on Diana Holt's door. Miss Marple knew this because Mrs. Bancroft's cook saw him arrive, and because Dorothy, on a perfectly innocent errand to return Diana's casserole dish, which she had borrowed 2 years ago and finally decided to return, found Philip in Diana's sitting room looking extremely unwell. Dorothy had not planned to report back. But Dorothy was Dorothy. and then she noticed things without meaning to, which was a talent she had always slightly underestimated. He was agitated, Dorothy told Miss Marple at supper, frowning slightly at the memory. Not just sad, agitated. He was trying to get Diana to, I don't know, agree to something. Contest the will, I think he said. He seemed to think she had grounds. She said she didn't. He said she didn't understand. She said she understood perfectly. Dorothy pushed her potatoes around her plate. She asked him to leave. He wasn't quite ready to leave. It was a bit uncomfortable, actually. What else did he say? Dorothy's frown deepened. He said something odd. He said, and Diana hadn't told him anything, mind you. She'd barely spoken. He said, the charitable trust doesn't need it. They'd get along without it. Gerald wouldn't have wanted it to cause all this. And Diana said, Gerald wanted exactly what he wrote. And Philip said, Dorothy paused. Philip said, he wrote it in August. He didn't know then what would happen. Silence. Dorothy looked up. What does that mean? I'm not entirely sure, Miss Marple said, which was nearly true. What it meant was this. Philip Rowe, panicked by the letter, had gone to Diana to find an ally, someone who might contest the will, muddy the waters, make the estate messy enough that the charitable trust would accept a settlement and Philip would get something. He had gone to Diana, and in doing so, he had said too much. He didn't know then what would happen. What would happen? Not what did happen. Not, as a grieving nephew might say, what happened to him, what the illness did, how it went, or what would happen. Future tense, spoken about a man already dead. The tense of someone who had known, in August, what they planned to do before September was out. Not proof, not in a court. But Diana Holt had heard it. And Diana Holt, Miss Marple suspected, was not a stupid woman. Davies came to Chippingcroft on Sunday. She hadn't expected this. She had expected to have to go to him or to work through another layer of the gossip chain. But apparently the letter, or Philip's reaction to it, had shaken something loose in the young man, because he arrived at the post office asking for Constable Briggs with the look of someone who has made a decision and is frightened of it and doing it anyway. Miss Marple was buying stamps she didn't need when he came in. She watched him speak to Carol, Janet Foley's efficient, a slightly cold niece, who directed him to the police house. She watched him go, collar turned up against the wind, thin shoulders set with a kind of desperate resolution. Good, she thought, good boy. She bought her stamps. She nodded at Carol. She walked out into the grey October morning and stood for a moment on the pavement. It was moving now. Things that start moving have their own logic, their own gravity. Davies would tell Constable Briggs about the will and about Philip knowing. Briggs would be sceptical. He was always sceptical, that was his nature. Dorothy said he'd been sceptical since school, but he would make calls, and the calls would reach someone less sceptical. And Albert Fitch was ready. She had done what she could do. The rest was not hers. She walked back along Church Street slowly. He passed the post office and the Red Lion and the butcher's, past the turning for Larkspur Lane, where number 14 sat with its dark curtains and its wreath and its washed teacup and whatever truth the kitchen still held. She was tired, genuinely tired. Not the useful alert tiredness of a mind working hard, but the other kind, the kind that comes after. Her knees ached, which she considered ungrateful of them, given that she'd done nothing more athletic than walk half a mile. She thought of Albert's knee. She thought of Gerald, who had noticed. Some people are decent. It is worth remembering that. Some people go through their quiet lives noticing other people's small pains, and this is not nothing. This is in fact quite a lot. She went back to Dorothy's house. She had tea, and she did not knit. Her knitting had sat untouched in her bag since Tuesday, which was unlike her. And she picked it up now and held it, but didn't start. Outside the window, the October light was going, the way it does in England, quickly and without apology. The village was still. It wouldn't be still for long. Constable Briggs came to Dorothy's house on Monday morning, and he was, as Dorothy had always said, sceptical. He was a large man, pink-faced, with the careful movements of someone who has learned not to knock things over in small rooms. He sat in Dorothy's sitting room with his notebook open and a cup of tea he clearly didn't want. And he listened to Miss Marple with the particular expression of a man performing patience. She told him about Albert, about the route change, how about Philip at the garden gate at 7:30 on Tuesday morning, 5 days before Albert changed his route. She watched Briggs correct himself mentally when she said this, watched him realize he'd had it backwards. She told him about the will changed in August, about Davies, about Philip's visit to Diana and the words he'd used. What would happen? Briggs wrote things down, slowly, with the deliberateness of a man who writes slowly to give himself time to think. "This is all very circumstantial, Miss Marple," he said at last. "Yes," she agreed, "it is. Albert Fitch saw someone leaving. Could have been anyone. Albert Fitch has delivered post on Larkspur Lane for 22 years. He saw Philip Rowe in the summer, and he remembered him. Postmen notice faces, Constable. It is, you might say, occupational." Briggs tapped his pen against his notebook. Dr. Somerton signed the certificate. Dr. Somerton expected Gerald Holt to die of heart failure. I imagine that made it somewhat easier to see heart failure. She said it without criticism. It was simply true. Another pause. Briggs looked at his tea. At his notebook, out of the window. "Davies has made a statement," he said, almost to himself. "Has he?" said Miss Marple, who knew perfectly well he had. "Comes to about the same as what you're telling me." He tapped the pen again, a slow rhythm, thinking out loud without quite meaning to. Philip Rowe knew about the will change, came to argue about it in September, came back, allegedly, before the death, and said to Diana Holt, words to the effect of, "Gerald didn't know in August what would happen." Miss Marple folded her hands. "He used the future tense, Constable Briggs, about a past event. People under strain occasionally say the thing they are actually thinking." Briggs looked at her. She looked back. He closed his notebook. "I'll need to speak to Albert Fitch formally. He's expecting you. I believe he's home until noon." Briggs stood with the slightly defeated air of a man who came to manage a situation and is leaving with a task list. He picked up his hat, put it down again. "Miss Marple," he said, not quite looking at her. "The letter, the one sent to Rowe, from the solicitor's firm?" A small silence. "What letter?" Miss Marple said pleasantly. Briggs looked at her for a long moment. His mouth did something that was almost a smile, and chose not to be. "Right," he said. "I'll see myself out." The exhumation order took 4 days. Miss Marple knew it was coming. Briggs had found, it seemed, a detective inspector in Cirencester who was considerably less sceptical than himself. A woman named Hargreaves, who had driven out on the Tuesday and spoken to Albert and Davies, and apparently also to Diana, who had, according to the thread of information that reached Miss Marple via Dorothy's cook, via Mrs. Bancroft's cook, via a complicated route she didn't entirely follow, confirmed the exact phrasing Philip had used in her sitting room. He didn't know then what would happen. Diana had remembered it precisely. Had Miss Marple suspected, written it down the moment Philip left her house. Not a stupid woman. The digitalis result came back on Thursday. Elevated levels. It significantly elevated, not the catastrophic excess of a reckless poisoner, but a careful doubling over several days that had built up quietly in Gerald Holt's system until his compromised heart simply gave out, as everyone had always expected it would, just helped. Helped along by someone patient and cold and frightened of losing money. Dorothy told her over breakfast with the gravity of someone delivering very serious news, which it was. "Philip Rowe was arrested last night," she said. She sat down. She looked for once genuinely shaken. "In Cheltenham. He'd gone back, presumably to, I don't know, run perhaps or just go somewhere familiar." Miss Marple said nothing. "Gerald," Dorothy said, and then didn't say anything else for a moment. Just Gerald. His name, sitting alone in the breakfast room. He was just a quiet man. He didn't bother anyone. He changed his will because he wanted to do something decent with what he had. That was all. "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and Philip," Dorothy stopped. Started again. "Philip had dinner here once, 2 years ago, when he was visiting Gerald. He brought wine. He was very charming. He asked about the garden." She looked at her toast. "I liked him. Most people did," Miss Marple said. "That was rather the point of him." Dorothy was quiet for a while. Miss Marple didn't fill the silence. Some silences should be left alone. They have their own work to do. Outside, the October morning was thin and pale, the kind of light that doesn't commit to anything. A blackbird was doing something vigorous in Dorothy's neglected rosebeds, and Miss Marple watched it with mild approval. "What happens to Diana?" Dorothy asked eventually. "She inherits what Gerald left her." "Modestly, I think. The bulk goes to the trust as he intended. She'll be all right." "Will she stay?" Miss Marple considered. "I don't think so. This village will always be the place where her husband was murdered. That's a heavy thing to wake up with every morning." She looked at her tea. She might go to the coast, somewhere new, start differently. Dorothy nodded. She seemed to find this reasonable, if sad. She found Albert at his garden gate on Thursday afternoon, the same day the arrest was confirmed in the village, which it was, thoroughly and with considerable enthusiasm. Chippingcroft would be talking about this for 10 years at minimum. Miss Marple had a precise sense of how long villages hold on to things. Albert had heard, obviously, and he looked like a man who had put something down after a long time carrying it, and was still surprised by the lightness. "They've charged him," he said when he saw her. "Yes." He nodded, looked at his hands. The same big, weather-reddened hands she'd seen in Dorothy's garden, but different now, or not different exactly. The same hands, but he was holding them differently. "I keep thinking," he said, "if I'd just said something on the Wednesday. When I heard he'd died, if I'd just gone straight to Briggs." "Mr. Fitch," Miss Marple said firmly, "you'd have gone to Briggs with a sighting of a man leaving a house at 7:30 in the morning. You'd have said, and this is what Briggs would have heard, that you'd seen Gerald Holt's nephew leaving Gerald Holt's house in the early morning. Briggs would have written it down, filed it. He noted that Philip Rowe had presumably visited his uncle, and that would have been that." She paused. The death was already signed off. What you saw alone wasn't enough. It's what it connected to that mattered. Albert was quiet for a moment. "You did that," he said, "the connecting." "You made it possible," she said. "That's different from nothing. That's rather a great deal, actually." He looked away, down the lane, where the afternoon was going gold at the edges, the way October afternoons do, right before they give up entirely. He was a man of small movements, and he didn't show things easily, but she could see it. Relief. Real relief. The kind that lives in the body, in the shoulders, in the set of the jaw. "He noticed my knee," Albert said. It was the same thing he'd said before, in Dorothy's garden, but he wasn't repeating it for her benefit. He was repeating it because it was the thing he kept coming back to. I'd been limping all of June, July, never mentioned it to anyone. And one morning, Gerald Holt comes to the door for his post and says, quite casual, "That knee giving you trouble? My brother had the same thing. Heat and rest. He swore by it." Albert's voice was steady, but only just. Just said it. Like it was nothing. Like he'd been watching and just noticed. Miss Marple nodded. "That's the kind of man worth fighting for," she said quietly, not grandly, just as a fact. Albert blinked, looked at her, and then he nodded once, and that was enough, and they stood for a moment in the October afternoon that was going gold and then going grey. Two people who had never met 2 weeks ago and would probably not see each other again, and said nothing, because nothing needed saying. She left on Thursday morning. The taxi came at 8:30. Dorothy had wanted to drive her, but Miss Marple had said no, firmly and kindly, because Dorothy's driving was a matter of some concern, and the station was 20 minutes away, and she'd rather arrive intact. Dorothy had argued, and then accepted this with the grace of a woman who knows her own. Driving is a matter of some concern. She stood on the front path, while Miss Marple put her bag in the taxi. The roses were still good. The lawn still wanted doing. "You'll come back," Dorothy said. It wasn't quite a question. "I expect so. You have excellent seed cake." "I do." Dorothy folded her arms against the cold. She looked for a moment the way she had looked at the dancing class in Bath, uncertain in a way she didn't usually allow herself to be. "Jane, this sort of thing, does it? Does it get easier, knowing what people are capable of?" Miss Marple looked at her. "No," she said honestly, "but it does become less surprising, which is a different thing. It means you can see it coming, which means sometimes," she paused, "sometimes you can do something about it before it goes too far." Dorothy nodded, not entirely comforted, but satisfied with the honesty. She kissed Miss Marple on the cheek. Miss Marple patted her arm. "Do the lawn," Miss Marple said. "Oh, be quiet," Dorothy said warmly. The train was on time. For once. She found a seat by the window, forward-facing, which she preferred, as she didn't like watching the world recede, and settled her bag on the rack and sat down, and looked out at Chippingcroft, passing slowly as the train pulled away from the station. Stone walls. Allotments at the edge of town, neat and stripped back for winter. The church tower with its lean, the cracks still unrepaired, the diocese still not responding. Philip Rowe would go to trial. Davies would give evidence. Albert would give evidence. Diana Holt's account of those 8 words, he didn't know then what would happen, would sit in a courtroom and mean exactly what it meant. And a jury would hear it, and the digitalis results would be presented by a pathologist in careful technical language. And at the end of it, Philip Rowe would go to prison, and the charitable trust would receive Gerald Holt's estate, Ian Chippingcroft would talk about it for 10 years at minimum. Justice, she thought. Slow and imperfect and full of procedure and paperwork, and the wrong people asking the wrong questions at the wrong times, but arriving, eventually, usually, if someone pointed it in the right direction. She reached into her bag. Her knitting was there, untouched since Tuesday of last week. Blue wool, she was making something for her nephew's youngest, a scarf or possibly a hat. She hadn't quite decided. She pulled it out and looked at it. Held the needles, didn't start, not yet. The countryside was going past, bare fields, hedgerows, a farmhouse with smoke coming from the chimney, ordinary and solid and real. A horse standing perfectly still in a paddock for no apparent reason, the way horses sometimes do, simply being there, enormous and calm, as she thought about Gerald Holt in his study. The morning light coming in, probably. A cup of tea. His pills taken, as always, because Diana was diligent and he was obedient in the small medical ways that older men sometimes become. He would have been reading, perhaps. He was the type. Or simply sitting with his tea, quiet, the village going about its morning outside his window. He hadn't known. That was the mercy of it, if there was a mercy. He hadn't been afraid, hadn't suffered in the dramatic sense, had simply gone, in a chair in a room he knew, in a village he had chosen, on an ordinary Wednesday morning. He had changed his will in August because he wanted to do something decent with what he had. That was the last freely chosen act she knew of. That would do. As last acts went, that would more than do. She put her knitting away, watched England going past the window, grey gold and familiar and full of people living their small, important lives, noticing each other's knees, carrying their post bags, keeping their routes, changing them when they had to. The train moved steadily south. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap and closed her eyes and let the rhythm of it carry her home. The train stopped at Kemble for 6 minutes. No announced reason. It never was, in Miss Marple's experience. Trains simply stopped sometimes, the way thoughts do, mid-sentence, for no reason you could pin down. A few passengers looked at their watches. The young man across the aisle made a noise of frustration, and then went back to his newspaper, which Miss Marple thought showed reasonable adaptability. She looked out at Kemble Station. A porter was moving a trolley with the unhurried certainty of a man who has moved trolleys at Kemble Station for 20 years, and sees no reason to change pace now. A woman in a yellow coat was reading a letter on the platform bench, quite absorbed, one hand pressed to her mouth. Good news or bad news, impossible to say, but something that mattered. A small boy was attempting to feed a biscuit to a pigeon that was not interested in the biscuit and was making this clear. Ordinary life, all of it, carrying on. She thought, not for the first time, about how much happened underneath the ordinary. Not dramatic things, not, usually, murder. But the quiet subterranean business of people managing each other, needing things from each other, fearing things, wanting things they wouldn't say out loud. The woman with the letter, of the porter with his trolley. The boy and the pigeon, which was its own small negotiation going badly. She had been asked once, by a young journalist, very earnest, who had somehow got hold of her name in connection with some business in St. Mary Mead, how she had learned to understand people so well. She had thought about it properly before answering, which seemed to disconcert him. "I've had a great deal of time," she'd said finally, "and not very much else to do with it." He'd written something else entirely in his article. something about intuition and feminine insight, which she found both flattering and entirely beside the point. It wasn't intuition. It was attention. Just attention, sustained over a long time, to the way people behaved when they thought no one important was watching. In villages, you learned this quickly or you didn't learn anything at all. Villages are laboratories of human nature, small and controlled and repetitive. The same types appear again and again in different costumes. The charming man who is charming because charm is useful. The composed woman whose composure is a door, not a window. The decent man who notices things quietly and doesn't make a speech about it. Philip Rowe was not the first charming, frightened man she had known. He would not be the last. He had wanted money, and he had been willing to remove a person to get it, and the person he had chosen to remove was someone who had never done him harm, and had in fact given him money twice, and simply asked in the end to dispose of his own estate as he saw fit. That was all Gerald had done, decided for himself, and Philip could not tolerate it. She felt, again, the particular tiredness that came with this kind of thing. Not physical, something older. The tiredness of having seen the same pattern enough times to recognize it immediately, and still not be able to prevent it, only sometimes to unravel it after. The train moved. She was home by 2:00. St. Mary Mead received her in its usual fashion, which was to say without ceremony, because the village had long since accepted Miss Marple as a fixture in the way it accepted the post office and the elm on the green, and the fact that the chemist always ran out of aspirin on Fridays. She was simply there, and then she had been away. And now she was back. And the village absorbed this without particular comment. Mrs. Clement waved from across the road. Miss Marple waved back. Her cottage was cold, 2 weeks empty. The chill had settled into it properly, and she moved through it, opening curtains and checking that nothing had gone wrong in her absence, which was a habit left over from the years when things had occasionally gone wrong in her absence. The garden was holding up. The kitchen was fine. The sitting room was exactly as she'd left it, her armchair at its angle by the window, her reading glasses on the side table, the small stack of library books she hadn't finished. She put the kettle on. While it boiled, she stood at the kitchen window and looked out at her garden. It was past its best for the year. Everything pulling back, drawing in, the last of the colour going from the beds. She didn't mind October gardens. There was something honest about them. They didn't pretend. Tea made, Archie carried it to her armchair and sat down. And the cottage settled around her with the particular warmth of a place that knows you, which sounds fanciful but is simply the truth of familiar spaces. The chair was right. The light was right. Outside, St. Mary Mead was going about its afternoon. She thought about Dorothy's garden, the roses that were quite good, the lawn that wanted doing. She thought about Diana Holt in her cottage with the dark curtains, and hoped, genuinely hoped, that she would go to the coast, somewhere with a sea view and no particular associations. Somewhere she could be someone without a history attached. She thought about Albert Fitch on his bicycle tomorrow morning, route unchanged, knee permitting, arriving at each house in exactly the right order, at exactly the right time, as he had done for 22 years, and would presumably do for however many years remained to him. Post bag on the correct shoulder. Tires properly aired. There was something very good about that, she thought. About a man who did his route, noticed what was around him, told the truth when it mattered, even though it frightened him. Albert Fitch was not a dramatic person. He would never be written about in the sort of articles that got things entirely wrong. He had simply seen a thing, and eventually, when it counted, said so. That was courage, actually. The undramatic kind. The kind that didn't feel like courage to the person doing it, just felt like heaviness, and lost sleep, and the fear of being involved. And then the decision, made quietly, to be involved anyway. She picked up her knitting from her bag. Blue wool, nephew's youngest. A scarf or hat? She made the decision now, sitting in her chair with her tea, scarf. A hat was too complicated to get the size right without measuring, and she was in no mood for complications. A scarf was forgiving, long and straight and forgiving. She cast on. The needles began their click. Outside, a car went past. Someone called to someone across the street. She couldn't hear the words, just the sound of it, familiar, neighbouring. A door opened and closed somewhere. A dog barked twice and stopped. Village sounds, the texture of ordinary life, which was what everything was in aid of when you came down to it. Ordinary people going about their ordinary days without anyone removing them from those days prematurely for the sake of an inheritance. Our Gerald Holt had sat in his study on a Wednesday morning with his tea and his newspaper, and whatever small thoughts occupied a quiet man in a quiet village. He had expected an ordinary day. He had been entitled to an ordinary day. She would not forget him. She rarely forgot them, the ones it had been about, the ones who had not been there to be helped, but only, in the end, to be answered for. They accumulated over the years a quiet company. She did not find it morbid. She found it appropriate. A decent man who noticed a postman's knee. It was not nothing. It was not nothing at all. Click, click, click. The scarf grew by 3 stitches, then 5, then 10. Outside the light was going, and St. Mary Mead was settling into its evening, and Miss Marple sat in her chair and knitted and thought of nothing much, which was, after everything, exactly what she needed